So if you want to completely vaporize a stainless steel cable in like a fraction of a second.
Oh, yeah, just drop it across the exposed terminals of a 30 amp hour portable radio battery.
Exactly. And it doesn't even melt, you
Mhm.
know? The internal resistance of those modern lithium cells is just so incredibly low that the instant current dump basically flashes the metal into a cloud of plasma before you even have time to blink.
Right. You're holding this massive reservoir of instant kinetic energy in this surprisingly small, totally benign-looking plastic box.
It looks harmless.
It does. And I think we treat the airwaves and honestly the gear we use to manipulate them
Yeah.
with this sort of casual familiarity. Like we fire up a radio and expect the physical world to simply step out of the way of our RF footprint.
Yeah,
But the physical world violently refuses to be ignored.
it really does. And welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking a pretty dense stack of sources today, mostly centered around issue 182 of the Random Wire newsletter, alongside several really technical posts from its sister site, etherhim.com.
There's a lot of ground to cover.
There really is. And our mission for you today is to explore this crazy collision between the nostalgic, sort of raw physics, homebrew radio culture of the past and the hyper-complex, heavily networked digital reality of modern amateur radio.
It's a huge shift.
Right. So we're going to examine the localized power of new budget handhelds, analyze the rumored duty cycle architecture of Yaesu's upcoming repeater hardware, and dig into the hidden IT burden of running Linux digital nodes.
Oh, the IT burden is real.
It is. And finally, we'll unpack the brutal, inescapable physics of why living trees are basically mortal enemies with your signal.
It's just a fascinating snapshot of where the hobby is right now because, the technology has fundamentally evolved from scavenging bare copper wire to writing shell scripts and managing Bluetooth network paths.
Totally different skill set.
Exactly. But the core architectural drive remains the exact same. It's all about optimizing that invisible space between your antenna and the rest of the planet.
Yeah, that drive to connect. And the author of the Random Wire newsletter actually anchors this whole issue with a tribute to that core drive. He opens with this really nice thank you to his Uncle Jim.
W7FBS, right?
Yep, W7FBS. Thanking him for introducing him to amateur radio in the first place.
Yeah.
Jim was part of this homebrew generation in Hoquiam, Washington. And, I mean, this wasn't an era of just ordering a pre-tuned multi-band array online and having it show up the next day.
No, you had to build it.
Right. Jim scavenged parts from old broadcast sets to build these glow bug transmitters, and he claimed this attic room, casting this thin piece of wire out the window to a nearby tree, and he was basically pulling the entire world into this small logging down.
That image, the solitary wire strung out to a tree branch, it's like the iconic visual of early amateur
It
radio.
really is romantic, right?
Very romantic. And it represents a brilliant localized engineering solution for the time
Mm-hmm.
because you need height for your antenna to lower your takeoff angle, right?
Yeah.
And a towering evergreen provides like 60 feet of vertical support absolutely free of charge.
Free tower. But, and this is where the physics come in, relying on that tree introduces a massive physical compromise. I mean, running a bare or even a thinly jacketed wire into a live tree means you are coupling a high-voltage RF field directly into hundreds of gallons of conductive sap.
Yeah, you're not just radiating into the ether anymore. You are actively dumping RF energy straight into the vascular system of a plant.
Which is wild to think about.
Well, the military actually tried to exploit that exact conductive property over a century ago.
Wait, really?
Yeah. In 1904, Major General George Owen Squire, he was with the U.S. Army Signal Corps, he patented what he called the tree antenna.
The tree antenna.
He formally dubbed it Floor Adventure.
A floor adventure, that sounds like a theme park ride.
I know, right? But the idea was to use the living root system and the sap-filled trunk as this massive natural vertical radiator for field communications.
Okay, so a giant biological antenna. But the newsletter lays out exactly why Floor Adventure is actually an RF nightmare for the modern operator. They break the physics down into 4 distinct categories.
And the first one is brutal.
Yeah, the microwave effect, right. Direct RF absorption. Because sap is this complex solution of water and electrolytes, it acts as a lossy conductor.
Exactly.
So the electromagnetic field couples with the tree, and instead of propagating out to Japan or wherever, a huge portion of your transmit power is just wasted vibrating the molecules inside the wood.
You are literally heating the timber from the inside out.
Yeah.
You're trying to cook a 50-year-old evergreen.
Which is not the goal.
No. But honestly, the secondary effect, detuning,
Right.
is arguably worse if you're trying to maintain a reliable station.
Because it messes with your match.
Right. The proximity of the tree trunk creates parasitic capacitance. So the physical mass of the tree electronically lengthens your antenna system. But the real headache is that a tree is a dynamic environment.
Oh, because the moisture content changes.
Exactly. If you tune your antenna on a dry Monday and get a perfectly flat SWR,
You think you're good to go.
right, but then the rainstorm hits on Tuesday, it completely alters the dielectric constant of the environment around your wire.
So the bark gets soaked, the sap flow shifts.
The velocity factor of the wire changes, and suddenly your transmitter is folding back its power because your SWR has just spiked through the roof.
It's a completely moving target.
It is. And then you also have to contend with dielectric loading. The author calls this the bioload.
I love that term.
It's accurate. The tree basically becomes an unintentional, highly inefficient parasitic element in your antenna system.
Right, it absorbs the energy asymmetrically.
Exactly. It creates this massive RF shadow. So, you might establish excellent propagation to the east, but the sheer physical bulk of the trunk creates a near total attenuation zone to the west. You're just blocked.
So electrically, it's a mess. But then you add the mechanical realities to those electrical problems, and the wire is basically doomed.
Oh, the mechanical sawing.
Yes. The fourth issue the newsletter highlights. Because a tall conifer sways constantly in the wind, and if your wire is anchored tightly, that sway turns the rough bark into high-grit sandpaper.
It'll just chew right through the wire jacket.
Exactly, shorting the element directly against wet wood, or it just snaps the wire entirely under tension.
So what are the solutions? The sources give some really practical structural workarounds, mostly emphasizing mechanical isolation.
Like the 2-foot rule.
Right, the 2-foot rule, which just dictates keeping the radiating element at least 24 inches away from any major branches.
Which makes sense. And then there's utilizing the drip line.
Yeah, using a throw weight to suspend the wire from a high peripheral branch. That way it drops through free air, maximizing the distance from the conductive trunk.
It just hangs down straight.
Exactly. And finally, isolating the wire tension using a pulley system with a counterweight.
Oh, like tying a suspended gallon of water at the ground anchor.
Right. That allows the tree to move naturally in the wind, but it maintains a constant safe tension on the antenna geometry. You decouple the antenna from the environment.
Right, you let the tree be a tree and the wire stays safe, but, if you have to venture away from the convenience of your backyard trees to find a clear operating environment, you are completely reliant on your portable gear.
Which brings us back to the power discussion.
Yeah, the newsletter shifts focus to the hardware pushing the portable envelope right now. Specifically, they look at the Tide Radio TDH9.
Which is a beast of a budget radio.
It really is. Looking at the data they pulled from those YouTube reviewers, CAM6LYW and W6IWN, this budget handheld is hitting plus 9 watts of output power on both 70 centimeters and 2 meters.
Pushing nearly 10 watts from a handheld form factor. I mean, that completely changes the calculus of what you can reach from a remote grid square without having to lug around a full mobile rig.
Yeah, a 10-watt HT is wild.
The power amplifier design in these radios has just become incredibly efficient to allow for those peaks. But honestly, the raw RF output is almost secondary to the onboard digital routing capabilities.
No, you mean the APRS stuff?
Yeah. The inclusion of native Bluetooth and a built-in TNC for APRS beaconing, it's attempting to bridge the gap between just a simple analog transceiver and a network-aware digital node.
Though looking at the author's testing, the firmware execution for that APRS integration is still pretty hostile to the user.
Yeah, it's not exactly plug and play.
Not at all. To get the automatic beaconing to trigger, the author had to dive super deep into the menus. He had to disable the PTT-linked manual beaconing, set the internal timer to a 1/82nd interval, and even then, the TNC only successfully handed the packet to the RF stage sporadically.
It really highlights that just cramming a TNC onto a system on a chip doesn't automatically equate to reliable packet routing.
It really requires precise configuration. And the sources touch on the critical nature of packet pathing when you're using these portable setups. The author notes configuring the path to wide 11, wide 22.
Which is super important to understand.
Right, because that specific routing header instructs the local digipeater network on exactly how many times to retransmit the packet.
Yeah, in a sparse rural environment, that YD22 allows your packet to leapfrog across several distant nodes just to hit an eye gate.
But and this is a big but, if you drive into a dense urban environment with that wide E22 path still active on a 10-watt radio.
You are blindly flooding the local network.
Exactly. Every digipeater in range hears it, repeats it, and triggers adjacent digipeaters to repeat it again. You're consuming a massive amount of the shared bandwidth.
Which is why you drop that path to wide 1.1, wide 2.1 in a city. It localizes the footprint. But that requires the operator to actually understand the topology of the network they're hitting, not just, how to navigate the interface of their radio.
Right, you have to know where you are digitally. But speaking of the interface, the Bluetooth integration via the Oddmaster app is pretty cool. It attempts to abstract some of that complexity.
It's basically a cheat code for field ops.
It really is, because it bypasses that entire CH340 serial chip nightmare.
Oh, the driver issues with those cables are legendary.
Right. Instead of tethering a laptop to the radio with a finicky programming cable and fighting prolific drivers just to update your memory channels, you use a direct serial over Bluetooth protocol.
Yep. The app pulls repeater data geographically from your phone and pushes the VFO parameters straight to the handheld.
It essentially functions as a real-time digital provisioning tool.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
But that provisioning capability assumes you have the localized power to keep the station alive in the field.
And we are back to the vaporization incident.
We are. Because when you're operating heavily in the field, particularly for POTA activations parks on the air, the energy density required to sustain 10-watt handhelds or 100-watt mobile rigs means you have to haul high-capacity chemistry off the grid.
Right. And the Itherham post analyzing that EnjoyBot 12-volt 30-amp-hour LiFePO4 battery praises its integrated ports, but that cautionary tale from the author. And
about his daughter.
Yeah, his 10-year-old daughter dropping the stainless steel trolling cable across the main terminals. It just illustrates the sheer unyielding physics of lithium iron phosphate cells.
It's terrifying. Because unlike an old lead-acid battery that will, voltage sag heavily under a dead short.
Right, a lead acid just kind of groans and melts.
Exactly. But a LiFePO4 battery management system, if it fails to trip instantly, allows the incredibly low internal resistance of those cells to dump hundreds of amps in milliseconds.
The energy literally has nowhere to go but thermal conversion. It took that steel cable straight past its melting point into a vapor state.
Managing that kind of localized power in the field is a high-stakes requirement. You have to respect it.
Absolutely. But, pushing a high-wattage signal from a remote location is fundamentally useless if the infrastructure listening for it is saturated or thermally compromised or deafened by localized noise.
Your ecosystem is only as resilient as its weakest link.
Exactly. Which leads us to the huge infrastructure rumors circulating right before Hamvention.
The Yaesu DR3X repeater.
Yes. The telemetry from the Yaesu USA YouTube broadcast and that site, xreflector.es, points to a substantial architectural shift for the third generation of System Fusion.
The specs are beefy.
Very. The raw specs note 85 watts on VHF and 65 watts on UHF, which is a definitive step up from the 50-watt ceiling of the current DR2X.
Yeah, increasing the final amplifier output by 35 watts is a nice brute force approach to covering a wider geographic footprint. But honestly, the critical engineering metric buried in those rumors isn't the peak power.
It's the duty cycle, isn't it?
Exactly. The 100% continuous duty cycle at full power. That is the game changer.
Because the DR2X notoriously struggled with thermal management under sustained load.
Oh, yeah. If a club had a highly active net or an emergency communication scenario kept the repeater keyed up constantly, the finals would just heat soak.
And to prevent a catastrophic hardware failure, the repeater had to automatically fold back its transmit power.
Right, which shrinks its coverage area precisely when operators need it most. So engineering a chassis and a cooling array that allows continuous 85-watt transmission without thermal foldback, that fundamentally alters the reliability curve of a municipal repeater system.
They are drastically hardening the RF stage. But the rumors also indicate heavy integration of DSP-enhanced analog audio.
Which is huge for analog users.
Yeah.
Digital signal processing operating on the FM side of the repeater means the hardware isn't merely taking an analog audio voltage and, blindly retransmitting it alongside the noise floor.
Right, it's smarter than that.
Exactly. The DSP algorithms actively sample the incoming analog waveform, identify the human vocal frequencies, strip out the static and adjacent channel hiss in real time, and then remodulate a pristine audio signal on the downlink.
So it actively cleans the signal, but the most aggressive feature rumored, and the one I want to talk about, is IES, the Interference Evasion System.
Yeah, that is fascinating.
According to the breakdown, the repeater's receiver constantly monitors the noise floor on its uplink frequency. And if it detects a jammer or even just a sudden spike in localized RF interference that drowns out legitimate traffic,
Which happens all the time.
right, the repeater then transmits a digital command sequence over the downlink, basically instructing compatible system fusion radios to instantly shift their VFOs to a pre-programmed alternate frequency.
So the entire net just organically migrates to clean spectrum without any human intervention.
It's like a group of friends smoothly moving to a quieter booth in a loud restaurant.
That's a great analogy. It's basically dynamic frequency hopping applied to civilian infrastructure.
But doesn't this implementation of IES force a pretty difficult hardware reality onto the user base?
How so?
Well, a command protocol that actively shifts VFOs requires a highly specific digital handshake. If my current FT60 or even an older System Fusion radio doesn't possess the firmware to decode that IES telemetry payload, it stays locked on the jammed frequency.
Right.
So when the repeater commands the fleet to move, the legacy radios are basically left in the dark. They're instantly orphaned.
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
Now, the sources do indicate the DR3X remains backward compatible, allowing older hardware to access the primary frequency under normal conditions. However, your analysis of the IES protocol is accurate. A feature of that complexity cannot just be retrofitted via a software patch to older architectures.
They just don't have the hardware for it.
Exactly. IES is a definitive telemetry marker for the future. It serves notice to the user base that the next generation of Yaesu handhelds and mobiles will require advanced, proprietary digital integration to fully utilize the network.
So the hardware is demanding a much higher level of digital sophistication from the user. And that demand isn't isolated to proprietary protocols like System Fusion either.
Not at all.
The final segment of our source material, diving into those 5 recent posts on the Etherham site, perfectly illustrates how heavily the burden of IT administration now weighs on the modern amateur operator.
Oh, operating a radio has become inextricably linked to managing Linux environments and network architecture.
It really has. The skill set has completely bifurcated.
Yeah, understanding antenna resonance and RF propagation is no longer sufficient. Now, the operator must also understand packet routing, thermal throttling on microcomputers, and server file system management.
It's a whole different ballgame now, you know? And the Etherham posts document this reality perfectly. Like, the author dedicates an entire post just to selecting and assembling a passive cooling case for a Raspberry Pi 4.
Because so many operators use Raspberry Pis as the digital backbone for their MMDVM hotspots or APRS-I gates.
Right. And managing the thermal state of the Pi CPU is suddenly just as critical as managing the SWR of the antenna, because without a case engineered to draw heat away from the processor, the Pi thermally throttles, it drops packets, and it desyncs from the network.
And that hardware layer is just the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
The subsequent post detailing server maintenance on a Dellwise 3040 thin client running all Starlink 3, it exposes the software fragility inherent in these linked systems.
Yeah, the Dellwise nodes are fantastic low-power machines for running an Asterisk PBX backbone, but they rely on extremely limited internal eMMC storage, right? Usually just 8 or 16 gigabytes.
Barely anything by modern standards.
Exactly. And the author had to intervene because the node was running out of disk space. A Linux OS running a highly active digital node constantly writes connection data, error states, and network handshakes to its log files.
And if the operator doesn't actively manage the log rotation, those files just bloat until they consume the entire drive.
And then the kernel panics and the node crashes.
Right, so the radio operator is literally forced to drop to a command line to manually prune the var/log directory just to keep their RF link to the outside world functional.
It's a completely invisible form of labor.
It really is. And a labor that carries an increasing financial cost, too.
Oh, for sure. The author's post breaking down website economics and the creeping cost of domain renewals highlights the financial overhead of maintaining all this digital infrastructure.
From hosting club forums to maintaining DNS records for digital reflectors, the ecosystem just demands continuous funding.
It never stops. But, you know, the final Etherham post pulls us away from server racks and back to the massive uncontrollable physics governing the ionosphere, the sunspot mystery.
I love this post, because space weather dictates everything we do on the HF bands. Solar radiation ionizes the upper atmosphere, creating those refractive layers that allow signals to bounce beyond the horizon.
Right. But the author was attempting to analyze upcoming band conditions using two separate space weather tools, and he was receiving wildly divergent sunspot numbers.
Which is maddening.
It is,
Yeah.
because we are all observing the exact same star, yet the data outputs from these tools totally conflict.
Well, the conflict arises from the methodology, not the observation.
Wait, what do you mean?
So counting sunspots isn't just a simple optical tally. Like you don't just look through a telescope and count dots. The international standard, originally the Wolf number, utilizes a formula that heavily weights the appearance of organized sunspot groups over isolated individual spots.
Right.
But modern methodologies deployed by organizations like NOAA might utilize completely different algorithms that analyze the magnetic complexity of a region.
So they're measuring different things entirely.
Exactly. They might weight a complex beta-gamma-delta magnetic structure heavily because it has a significantly higher probability of producing an X-class solar flare.
Ah. So if one tool uses a raw optical count and the other utilizes a formula weighted for magnetic complexity, the outputs will literally never align.
Never. So for the operator trying to determine if, say, the 20-meter band is going to open up to Europe, the raw number is meaningless if you don't understand the algorithm generating it. You have to interrogate the methodology of your tools before you can trust the data they provide.
Wow. Which perfectly encapsulates the duality of the modern amateur radio experience, I think.
It really does. It is an incredibly demanding spectrum of knowledge. On one end, you have to respect the raw physical world, understanding the dielectric properties of tree sap, mitigating the abrasive friction of bark, and managing the terrifying internal resistance of a high-capacity lithium cell.
Right. And then on the exact same day, you have to configure Bluetooth serial protocols, prune Linux log files on an All-Star-Link server, navigate the digital routing topology of an APRS network, and part competing algorithms for solar weather weighting.
It requires a synthesis of disciplines that simply didn't exist a generation ago, which actually leaves me with a final thought to consider.
Lay it on us.
We began by looking back at Uncle Jim, a member of the homebrew generation, casting a thin piece of scavenged wire out his attic window into the trees, relying purely on the physics of the ether to connect with someone over the horizon.
Yeah.
As we transition deeper into an era defined by DSP-scrubbed audio, automated frequency hopping repeater systems, and radios programmed by smartphone apps, are we actually building a more robust version of Uncle Jim's vision? Or are we constructing an entirely separate closed digital landscape that merely uses radio frequencies as a convenient last-mile carrier for the internet?
Man, that fundamentally questions whether we are still exploring the airwaves or just building another network. Consider what protocols and physics you're relying on the next time you hit the push to talk. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible infrastructure around you, and we will catch you next time.